Hey, everybody. We are live on both my channel and Caleb's channel. So we're going to kind of co-host this, but I'll be interviewing. Caleb, my friend here, and also the founder of the Center for Political Innovation, has published a new book on Bob Avakian. It is called Letter to Bob Avakian. It is a very interesting book that covers, as you might expect if you've read any of Caleb's other books.
We're getting an echo, Peter.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's from me. That's from my end. Wow, that's on me. That is totally me. Wow, there you go. Now people know this is a genuine conversation. This is not staged. This is like we are speaking from the heart on Saturday night, and I have the YouTubes open, and they started talking as you were talking. So continue, Peter. There you go.
It's actually Saturday Night Live. Like you got the evidence. Right. So if you've read any of Caleb's other books, you would know that although there is a very obvious topic noted in the title and the theme, but it covers a broad range of things. And it's all obviously focused through the lens of Bob Avakian, but you are going to walk away with a lot more if you read this book. Now, what I'm basically going to do is, I think, cover most of our basic points and kind of tee you up to talk about what's important in this book. So I think it's probably good to just start with Bob Avakian. For people who are unaware, Bob Avakian is the chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party. He founded it in 1975. He's a 1960s New Left figure. And a lot of contemporary momentum is building that kind of sees the New Left as a rejection of Marx in one way or another. So what makes Bob Avakian stand out from his contemporaries in that respect? And why is he relevant now?
Well, during the 1970s, there were many 60s radicals who became communists. Many of them, many of the people who marched against the Vietnam War, many of the people who marched for civil rights became communists. And many of them looked to China for inspiration, as opposed to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was pushing détente and wanted to negotiate with the United States, but China had this revolutionary image with Mao and the Cultural Revolution. And so there were a number of different communist groups that were formed during the 1970s that were trying to become a new communist party that was aligned with China. Almost every single one of those groups has fallen apart or dissolved. The October League, the Communist Workers' Party, the Communist Labor Party, the Democratic Workers' Party. There was a whole alphabet soup of these groups. The Revolutionary Communist Party is still around, and they have survived that. And I would argue that that points to a certain level of leadership prowess on the part of Bob Avakian, that what many people tried to do for a decade or so and then gave up and went home, he's still doing. I mean, he's 82 years old at this point, and his group is still up and running. They've got bookstores, they got regular webcasts. He's making talks. He had an event at Riverside Church a few years ago with Dr. Cornel West. He's still going, and that is certainly commendable. I recently saw that Sansara Taylor, a leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party, who's younger, she's only a few years older than me. She has been going around criticizing wokeness, which I thought was very commendable. But the reason she's doing that, and the whole reason I decided to write this book, is because last summer they got canceled big time. Do you remember this, Peter? Do you remember watching this happen?
I do. It was early midsummer, like around there, if I remember right.
Yeah, July of last year, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. And that is one issue that the RCP and Sansara Taylor in particular have dedicated themselves to. They are pro-choice. They are in favor of abortion being legal. So they have this activist group called Rise Up for Abortion Rights, and they were in the front lines of leading the pro-choice protests all over the country. And AOC made a surprise appearance at one of their rallies and did a photo op with Sansara Taylor. And then immediately, Vice, The Intercept, Yahoo News, Daily Beast, all ran hit pieces about this cult, this multi-level marketing cult that is co-opting social justice language, and they just ran their name through the mud. And I read these hit pieces, and I disagree with the Revolutionary Communist Party on many issues, which I make clear in the book. But I read these articles, and I was like, these articles are ridiculous. I mean, first of all, one of the things it was claiming is that the RCP is co-opting social justice language in order to build their organization. The RCP was founded in 1975. Black Lives Matter started in what, 2013, 2012? So if
2011
anything,
at the very earliest.
Yeah, so if anything, Black Lives Matter is co-opting their language, right? They've been in the streets marching against police brutality since before you or I were born. You know, the RCP has been organizing around these issues. They started the October 22nd coalition to stop police brutality. They were in the streets of New York City around Sean Bell and around Amadou Diallo. They were a big factor in the LA rebellion of 1992. You know, their members, the rioting around Rodney King, their members were very key in like the protests that happened downtown after the Rodney King verdict happened, before LA kind of lit up in 1992. So for people to claim that the RCP is co-opting woke language, that's ridiculous. The wokes are co-opting them. I mean, you know, they have a really long record. They're the people that got flag burning legalized by the U.S. Supreme Court, 1984, Johnson versus Texas. An RCP guy at the Republican convention in 1984, he lit the American flag on fire, and they arrested him for flag desecration. He took it to the Supreme Court, and he got flag burning legalized, right? And that was, you know, it was a guy named Joey or Gregory Johnson, who was from the RCP. So their history of being active, being involved in protests, they were key. And, you know, when I was first coming around, the issue was protesting the Iraq War. And they were very key. They had something called Not in Our Name, which was an anti-war coalition that used like the Earth flag as its image.
I actually remember seeing them.
Yeah. And so what I was reading in these articles to make it sound like they just came out of nowhere and stay away from them. They're, you know, this scary group that's come out of nowhere to co-opt the abortion struggle. Like that was just so false. And they were interviewing these, you know, experts that are just like some college professor or something who's just like, oh yes, well, these are dangerous Stalinist organizations, blah, 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 blah. And I saw that and it made me angry because it was just everything that's wrong with the left nowadays, right? Is that, you know, they weren't interested in learning the actual history of the Revolutionary Communist Party, where they came from. All they wanted to do is find some kind of scandal and tattle on somebody, you know, and that's been a theme in a lot of your documentaries. And so, you know, that's really all that these people wanted to do. They weren't interested in where this group came from, what they believe, why they might be wrong about what they believe. They just wanted to point fingers. Oh, these are bad people. Aha, we found a scandal. And it was frustrating for me. So I thought that's when I first got the idea I might write this book. What do you think?
I think there's a key word that you mentioned there too that I would maybe like you to expand on, and it's the word cult. Anybody who starts research on the RCP and ends up going through their Wikipedia page, even the first thing that they're going to notice is that their Wikipedia page says in the first paragraph, I think it might even be the second sentence, they are generally known as a cult. Which it's a means to they weaponize the word cult against basically any group that's doing anything that requires leadership at this point. But I'm interested in maybe go into a little bit further as to how they've weaponized that word specifically against RCP.
Well, what's interesting is that, Netflix, you'll notice, is obsessed with cults. You watch a comedy on Netflix, it's going to be about a cult. You watch a documentary on Netflix, it's going to be about a cult. You watch a true crime movie, it's going to be about a cult. Like Netflix talks about nothing but cults practically, right? And it's just cults. There's groups, and it's like trying to like psych you up, like stay home, stay on your couch, and never get involved in any religious or political movement because it's probably a cult. You know, go ahead.
I'd even say they do that because they've helped curate the sort of fandom mode, which is a very like sort of consumer cult mode, and to direct you away from the fact that you might interrogate that. Here's the real cults, you know,
right? And it's a loose definition that has no meaning. Right. Yeah. I mean, the more you dig into it, you know, one man's cult is another man's political party, religion. I mean, it's a matter of being in the eye of the beholder on the one hand. And on the other hand, all organizations to some degree have central authority. All organizations are going to make some type of demand on their membership. The question
Yes.
is, there are some organizations that have a lot more cohesion than others, and there are some organizations that are very, very loose. There's some organizations where the leader is very glorified and almost worshipped. And there's some organizations where you don't even know who the leader is, and it's like a sliding scale. And this is how human beings tend to organize themselves. But the cult phobia kind of thing is really a part of the liberal order.
Yes.
It's part of the liberal coming out of the Second World War. And as the USA started facing off with the Soviet Union, there was this book, True Believer, that was widely read and promoted by Harry Truman that tried to equate the communists with the Nazis. And it was this argument that, like, well, we think for ourselves in the West, whereas these people in these other countries, they follow the leader. And it became a whole big part of like liberal propaganda. And then it gets even weirder, because if you get into the 1970s, you have the communist organizations, they're emerging, and then you have American intelligence kind of setting up various different groups to like recruit the people who would be communists. And that was a thing that was happening. Like the Hare Krishna movement was big among peace activists. And this was a religious sect from India that's actually quite conservative, right? I mean, very anti-communist, but they imported them to the United States, and they would show up at all the anti-war rallies and beat on their drums and dance around. And the kind of person who might become a communist would become a Hare Krishna. And so you had American intelligence kind of importing these different religious sects and groups in the 1970s. And then you have different sections of the American state infiltrating these various groups and using them against each other, which is something that comes up in this book. And then you have the ex-cult industry emerging, which involved kidnapping people, right? This professional kidnapping service where if your adult child, your college kid joins one of these groups, you can pay Ted Patrick hundreds of dollars to go, grab them off the street and lock them in a basement and browbeat them until they renounce the group. And it turned into it was a nutty aspect of the liberal order. And, when you talk about the Yankee and Cowboy War and the divisions in the ruling class was fighting each other back in the 1970s, and they were utilizing various political and religious organizations for that end, right? There was a fight between Ronald Reagan and the conservatives and Richard Nixon and all of them versus, the kind of liberal Eastern establishment, the Rockefellers, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter, and that a lot of different organizations from all kinds of religious and political backgrounds ended up being kind of pawns in this fight. And that's where the whole cult mindset, that's where that comes out of, right? And so that's kind of interesting. And then it's just kind of stuck in our culture, right? And at this point, there's this cult phobia. And what they're really trying to tell people in the United States is don't join any kind of movement. It's okay to sit on the internet and argue about your beliefs. It's okay to watch influencers and streamers you might like, but don't join an actual group. Don't join an actual community. That's what they're really banking on, because they know that things in the United States are getting rough. It's really hard for people to survive on their own. People are angry. They want to do something about it. It's not simply a matter of wanting to feel like they have all the answers. And they're really, really nervous about the rise of some kind of illiberal movement in the United States that could counter the rise of the low-wage police state. And so this is what the new cult scare, you might call it, I think is about. And that the RCP has been viciously targeted around this. They, as much as I disagree with their political line, and I make that clear in the book, the smear they've been hit with, that they're a cult, that they're going to brainwash you, that is bullshit. And anyone who's been around them for a few minutes can tell you that's bullshit. So, yeah.
Something that would be good is if, and I'm going to use this to transition to the next question, but it would be good to maybe articulate some kind of material analysis of what a cult really is, because it sits on basically a fully idealist spectrum at this point. Yeah, it's not even a thing, really.
Yeah, well, when I was in a kid, at my church library, they had a lot of really old books, from like the 1920s and stuff. And I remember in the church library, I found a book called The Four Major Cults. And I looked at it, and it was this really old book, and it said it had Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, Christian Science, and Jehovah's Witnesses. Right. And in Spanish, my wife speaks Spanish. In Spanish, they don't have a word for cult. The word they have is sect or secta. And that, especially if you go to the Middle East, there's always been religious organizations that are considered like so deviant from the mainstream of religion that they are small. Right. And so that is something that's been in our culture for many, many years. Right. In the Middle East, you have Christians, you have Muslims, you have Jews. But then you have Alawites, and then you have Yazidis, and you have these really small religions, right? And that's what cult used to mean. before it became a weaponized intelligence term, right? It was the English version of the Spanish word secta, that refers to really small religious group that is so out of step with the mainstream religions that it's considered to be deviant or unhealthy or something like that. Right. That's what cult used to mean. Now it means something completely different. Now it means sit on your couch and watch Netflix, or else you're being brainwashed by Vladimir Putin. So there you go. But yeah.
Well, speaking of material distinctions that might be made, Avakian's theoretical framework, which is the official framework of the RCP, which I've seen officially referenced as various different things that ultimately total in the new synthesis of communism. It can sound, when you actually get into it, like when you read the, in preparation for this, I went into and I read part of a manifesto that had been written on it. But it can be very similar sounding to a critique of authoritarian socialism that we hear from like DSA or like the other non-Marxist leftists. At what separates RCP, the new synthesis of communism, and Bob Avakian from those sects specifically, if anything?
Well, right. That's a good question, because that's one of my major criticisms of his so-called new synthesis, is that it just seems to be a rehashing of the standard anti-authoritarian critique of socialist countries, except it's applied in an inconsistent way. He maintains the Soviet Union was socialist from the time of the Bolshevik Revolution until 1956. He maintains that China was socialist from the time of their revolution up until the death of Mao in 1976. But he says they made big mistakes and blah, blah, blah. But then all the other socialist societies he dismisses as revisionist and non-socialist and non-revolutionary. And he bases this on a very, like, there's no benchmark with which to measure it. It's, and I quote his exact words. And I made a really big point of doing that in the book. I never speak for him. I let him use his own words, right? And there's lot of
100% true too. Yeah. It's pretty extensive how much.
I let him use his own words. I do not characterize. I don't want to play that game, because you and I have had that done to us, where people say, well, what they mean is, and we didn't do that. We used his own words. And he says, well, what made the Soviet Union special under Stalin, what made, China under Mao special, was it had this level of democratic participation where the people were wrangling with the big questions and blah, 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 right? And there's no way to measure any of that, right? And if anything, that is not really what socialism is about in the Marxist sense. That is a fulfillment of the ideals of bourgeois democracy. Right. He's looking at bourgeois democratic society and saying, well, you claim to have a government of, by, and for the people, but it's actually very authoritarian. There's actually, a group of people. So we're going to make the ideals of bourgeois democracy come true. That's what he's saying. And that these other socialist societies aren't doing that, so they don't count. But China during the Cultural Revolution, he argues, was. Stalin kind of was during the Stalin years. So, and it's not consistent, and it lacks any real benchmarks. You can't point to anything in these societies. And this is also not what Marx advocated. I mean, Marx made clear socialism is a change in the means of production. It's a change in why the means of production function. Are they functioning according to the profits of private owners? Are they functioning according to a central plan? Are we eliminating production and the anarchy of production, or are we simply continuing to carry it out, maybe with a welfare state or something like that? And you don't get, and that is really my biggest critique of them, is that there is so little discussion of economics. They seem to have stripped Marxism of economics, right? It's a struggle against oppression. It's a struggle for equality. It's a struggle for democratic participation and the masses being involved. But there's nothing, the economic components, the capitalists and the workers, the problem of overproduction, the tendency, none of that is ever mentioned. So
there's a really big focus on emancipation and a damning of I think that this is a loose application given the multiple definitions of it, but economism. In your book, you note that he gives multiple definitions of economism, even within a single work. I think it was his autobiography you were referencing. You also assert that opposition to economism is pretty central to the whole theoretical framework. So what is Avakian's definition of economism, or an aggregate of his definitions of economism, and how would you contrast it with Lenin's definition of economism, and why is that distinction important?
Well, they more or less argue that if you ever start talking about the things that communists generally talk about a crisis of capitalism, overproduction, the conditions of the working class, machines replacing human labor, if you ever start talking about these things, you start talking about infrastructure decaying, you start talking about dropping living standards, they accuse you of, well, that's economism, right?
Mhm.
And in his autobiography, Bob Avakian, he defines economism multiple times in that autobiography, and he defines breaking with economism as the great achievement of the RCP. Like, that is just like the great achievement is when we broke with economism. Breaking with economism was this great step forward. And
so they're not class reductionists, is what you're saying. They're very much not class reductionists.
Right. Yeah. And the more you read it, the more you get into it. It's like they have stripped Marxism of economics, and then they're using this term that Lenin used called economism, which is used in the book What Is to Be Done. They're using, they're using that as their argument about why we shouldn't talk about it. Well, economism, as defined by Vladimir Lenin, is something very different. Economism isn't just when you talk about labor unions. Economism isn't just when you talk about deteriorating conditions. Economism is when you drop the call to overthrow capitalism. Economism is when you just tail behind the labor movement and the labor struggles, and you're not putting forward a revolutionary message. That's what it is. But there's nothing in Lenin's critique of economism that says we should therefore never talk about communism. Or about economics, about Marxist economics. And
absolutely, if anything, it's almost kind of pointing at the sort of Bernie Sanders progressive type at this point.
Yeah, and that, economism, Lenin kind of puts it in the same category as bowing to spontaneity, meaning whatever's trendy, whatever's hip, you just kind of run after it and say, we agree and we're communists, join us. You're not offering leadership. You're not teaching the masses anything. You're just kind of tailing after what they already believe. He puts that in the category of, bowing to spontaneity. And there's another term that Lenin uses where it's just, he's critiquing in this book, What Is to Be Done, that, now is the time that we should be the ones leading the masses of people. We should be putting forward demands and mobilizing the people. And the economists, what they want to do is they just want to follow after whatever the trade union secretaries are doing, whatever the leaders of the trade unions are doing. We follow behind it and say, oh, we're a political party. So we're lending a political character to the economic struggle. So therefore we're doing our job. And Lenin says, no, you're not doing your job. Your job is to actually make a revolution. And What Is to Be Done is a great book, but their distortion of it to mean never discuss economics, strip Marxism of the economic understanding, just kind of focus on this kind of, this struggle against authoritarianism, a struggle against the state. That is not what Lenin was talking about. And that's a complete distortion. And I would argue that in a lot of ways, the politics of the Revolutionary Communist Party, especially if you read Basics, which is like the book of Bob Avakian's, various quotations that they've assembled, it's more in line with Louis Auguste Blanqui, who was a thinker that existed alongside Marx, where, Marx polemicized against this guy Blanqui, because this guy Blanqui paid no attention to economics. It's like the state is bad. The state works for the rich people. It's bad. So we're going to take over. And when we take over, it's going to be good because we're in charge. We're going to be the new bosses. Well, that's not Marxism. Marx is saying, well, no, we're struggling to build a movement of the working class so that the broad working class can seize control of the means of production. We're not struggling to have, an uprising to justify a military coup. So once we're in charge, we can make everything good. And that also, and this is one thing I pointed to, is that in his definition of what communism is, I see, socialism, the first stage of communism, and eventually the higher stage of communism as being public ownership of the means of production, eliminating the system where profits are in command, organizing the economy in the interest of society so that growth is unlimited. That's what I see it as. He sees it as a government that includes mass participation of the people. The people are actually involved in decision making, and we're a government that is actively uprooting racism, actively uprooting sexism, actively uprooting anti-LGBT bigotry. This government that is actively kind of forcing a social justice agenda onto society. Well, that's a contradictory thing, because what if the people that you mass empower are racist? What if the people that you mass empower are sexist? I mean, it's like, so on the one hand, there's going to be mass participation, but on the other hand, he from above he has this agenda of right and wrong, which is very much like a liberal progressive agenda, what right and wrong is.
Idealism, like just assuming that you can dictate something onto the material world and have it happen.
Right, and he's gonna then, once they're in charge, they're gonna like make everyone not racist and make everyone not sexist. And I argue that this is Jacobinism. This isn't Marxism. After the French Revolution, you had a period they called the Reign of Terror, where the revolutionaries kind of took power and they tried to create like an egalitarian society. And they had, kind of mob rule for a while, and they had this vision of what an egalitarian society would be, and they mobilized the people to carry it out. And that's when we talk about the revolution eating its own children. And I would argue the Cultural Revolution in China was a lot like that. I've met many people from China, and most of them just say the Cultural Revolution was a nightmare. And that's what the Chinese Communist Party says, is that it was a nightmare, whatever.
Yes.
There is a small minority of people I've met from China. Let me emphasize, a very small minority who say, well, the Cultural Revolution was bad, but it was necessary. Right? Because there were so many people that didn't believe in communism, and it was necessary, but nobody thinks the Cultural Revolution was good, right? The Cultural Revolution was a nightmare. It was a nightmare of mass mob rule. And when it was brought to an end, when Deng Xiaoping came to power and arrested the Gang of Four, there was mass celebration, among the population, because finally the economy could grow again. One of the main beliefs of the Cultural Revolution was that you could achieve a higher stage in poverty, that at the low level of development that China was in at that time, they could get all the way to communism, and that's just not realistic, right? Communism is based on vast abundance.
Yeah. And also, I mean, the bad but necessary is also basically the justification given for bombing a bunch of civilians in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It's not necessarily a good justification, even if people accept it. Understanding this definition of economism, both Avakian's and Lenin's, and making the distinction between them, the kind of program put forward by Avakian, you could kind of put in the purview of wokeness, or at least it sounds like it could. In fact, a lot of this rhetoric that his worldview has is kind of, you characterized it specifically as a more ideologically coherent and honest statement of what is believed by most woke activists. However, like you said earlier, Avakian and the party have critiqued wokeness. So what distinguishes him from woke activists?
Good question. I mean, it's interesting because I really appreciated some Sarah Taylor's recent speech condemning wokeism. I really appreciated it, but she still kind of held on to this belief, that, well, Donald Trump is the main danger. That came across in her speech, right? And that appealing to people's anti-Trump sentiments should be the focus. And that, there are all these people in American society who have, that are inherently bad. They're racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-LGBT or whatever. And we need to be mobilizing against them. And that is more or less the woke worldview. But you'll notice that the RCP, even though, and I was shocked by this. I remember I got the email in my inbox. I'm on their email list, their press list. And they put out a press release in 2020, and it said like major announcement from the RCP. And I'm just like, okay. So I opened my email, right? And it's this article by Bob Avakian, and it's starting out like Trump is bad, Trump is awful. I'm like, okay, I've heard this before. I'm clicking down, get to the point. And then like the paragraph begins with, voting for Joe Biden will be one necessary step. Keep in mind, the RCP boycotts elections. They say don't vote. That's their general position. Do not vote. But in 2020, that was the first time they've ever endorsed a candidate, and it was Joe Biden. And I was just like shocked. I'm like, wow. I mean, for years, they've been telling people don't vote, be in the streets and protest. Voting is, giving legitimacy to the capitalist system. And when they finally did tell people to vote, they didn't even tell them to vote for a communist. They told them to vote for Joe Biden, and they still cling to this idea that, that Trumpism is the main danger. And that's what the woke people believe, right? That is the woke mindset.
Yes.
And the woke people also don't talk about economics. They also want their egalitarian vision, eradicating people they consider to be racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever,
the basket of deplorables.
Yeah, they want that, brought down from above. They also, they don't call it economism. They call it class reductionism, but they ignore, so what they believe is not very much different from what woke people believe. It's just that they carry with them, some admiration for Mao, God forbid. They carry with them some admiration for Stalin. And they also carry with them, they do on some level. And I was impressed. I went to their event on May 1st. Their May Day parade in New York City in Harlem, and even though they are anti-Russia and anti-China, they're still anti-war. And they were talking about the danger of World War III. They're not fully on board. They're warning, like saying we don't need to have World War III. So they're not fully on board. The wokes at this point are the biggest supporters of Ukraine. I mean, Vosh, I think he had a whole thing about fundraising for Ukraine, and and he's got the Bandera flag and all of that. And the woke people are the biggest supporters of World War III against Russia, World War III against China. And the RCP, for whatever reason, probably because of their heritage as an anti-war group and probably because of their connections, and we'll talk about that later, for whatever reason, they have held on to some of their anti-imperialist legacy, and that's not enough. And really what I talked about in the book is that when they got canceled last summer, that was Joe Biden and the Democrats making clear, we don't need your help, guys. We don't want your help. You know what I mean? We don't need you, right? And that should be a moment where they should look themselves in the face and say, so why are we aligning with these people when they clearly don't want our help? They clearly do not want our help. I think there was like Planned Parenthood, a number of pro-choice organizations signed a document after they got canceled where all these major pro-choice people said, we do not want Rise Up for Abortion Rights at our events. We consider them to be blah, 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 blah. But that, I mean, it was like the whole pro-choice movement basically, denounced the RCP. So why are they still the foot soldiers, the liberals, right? Why? What are they getting out of this? And well, we can get to other questions, so go on.
That pretty well segues into the thing I wanted to ask next. In the book, you observed Bob Avakian. He doesn't have the same kind of aversion towards coalition building that like ultra leftists do, which is also, I think, a fair distinction between he and the woke activists. But you also note that he does so without any grasp of Marx's articulation of the problem of overproduction. And this leads Avakian to a misunderstanding of fascism that ultimately leads him to misjudge his alliances within the ruling class. Firstly, why are individual alliances within the ruling class not class collaboration automatically? And secondly, why is Avakian's misunderstanding of fascism so important to understand in that context?
Well, the thing is, if you look at their talk of fascism, and if you look at some of the articles Bob has written recently, are actually pretty advanced in that they make the case for the fact that there are huge divisions in the U.S. ruling class right now. Absolutely true. And it's these kinds of divisions that lead to revolutions. Again, absolutely true. And he talks about how there was a division in the ruling class in Russia over World War I, over the Tsar, and that created a moment where the Bolsheviks could seize power. He talks about how there was a division in the ruling class in China. And then from there, from making this observation that, yes, there are big divisions in the ruling class and this could lead to a revolution, he therefore falls into, and we've got to defeat Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the main danger. Republicans are the main danger, etc. And then what is his logic for this? He says, well, the Republicans are fascists. Why are the Republicans fascists? And the reason given is they say sexist things, they say racist things, etc. Well, I point out in the book that fascism is not when rulers say sexist things or say racist things. There is an economic understanding of fascism that comes out of Marxism. We talk about Arpalm Dutt, that capitalism has this built-in problem of overproduction, where there's people become homeless because there are too many houses. People become hungry because there is too much food. And this is the built-in problem of capitalism. The worker cannot buy back what he produces. Poverty is created by abundance. And fascism is when you enter a prolonged crisis of overproduction, a section of the ruling class tries to take control of the government. They build a mass movement and try to utilize that mass movement to seize control of the government in order to reboot the economy with degrowth, right? By driving down living standards, by creating a slave labor underclass, by reducing consumption, by marching toward a big giant war that'll engage in mass destruction. The essence of fascism is saving capitalism from a capitalist crisis by using heavy-handed state power to enact degrowth policies, right? That is the essence of fascism. That comes from R. Palm Dutt. That comes from Georgy Dimitrov. That's what fascism is. Fascism is not when people say racist things, when people say sexist things, when people, that's not what fascism is. And the fascism, in terms of economics, is coming from the Biden side. That's where it's coming from. It's coming from absolutely. Biden. It's coming from Bill Gates. It's coming from the World Economic Forum. It's coming from the ultra rich, and the Trump faction represents the lower levels of capital that just want to make money, right? And do they say racist things to justify and rally support around them? Sure. Do they say sexist things in order to justify what they do? Sure. But if you look at Trump's presidency, it was largely defensive. It was just him rolling back economic policies that Obama put in the hopes of getting the gears of the economy going again for the lower levels of capital. He allowed drilling on public lands. He lifted taxes on Wall Street transactions. During Donald Trump's presidency, he did very little that one could consider to be fascist, right?
He did very little, period, honestly.
Yeah,
like, it wasn't really a big change in approach from Obama, like other than a few like hallmark things like the big tax cut, but like not a lot of other stuff really. Like his supposed revamp of healthcare is not a revamp of the healthcare system.
Yeah, and what has Biden done since he's been in office? Biden has indicted a black revolutionary organization. His Justice Department has targeted the People's Democratic Uhuru movement and has invoked the Foreign Agents Registration Act, a McCarthyist piece of legislation, to call them Russian agents, and is now trying to put them in prison for 10 years just for engaging in anti-war activism. That's huge. What has Biden done? Well, Biden's administration is full of people that believe the problem in the United States is overpopulation. And that he's appointed a number of people into his administration who say that overpopulation is the problem. We must reduce consumption, that are open Malthusians. You sent me an article today, and I had a chance to skim it, but maybe you can explain it about his infrastructure policies.
Yeah, I was actually just going to bring that up. I'm in the middle of writing a piece on it myself about this infrastructure recommendation that just came out. He has let me quickly grab you the name of this council that the National Infrastructure Advisory Council, which has put forward recommendations for actually loosening and, in fact, getting rid of restrictions that prevent privatizing of our water infrastructure, which is, in my opinion, the absolute most batshit horrible idea that, in my opinion, I've never seen a president or his administration, more realistically, put forward such a fascistic thing. Like, the crux of what I'm writing about it involves Dutt's definition of fascism, a totalitarian dictatorship of big capital, exercising this type of control over things like our natural resources. And if you privatize water, like, to talk about open Malthusianism, that is absolutely 100% the easiest lever by which you would have to exercise any kind of Malthusian agenda. Forget whether or not they are or aren't Malthusian. It doesn't even matter. The idea of privatizing it gives you the means to deny water. That's really the key here. With a public water system, you have the ability for the public to at least engage some degree of recourse in the event of mishandling or misuse or even mistakes. If you hand those pieces of infrastructure over to a private, unaccountable entity, that's essentially the basis by which to deny people water. You need water every 3 days or you're dead. Like, it's a simple way of killing a ton of people, even if it's not on purpose. That's what that is.
Yeah, well, you remember the Detroit water crisis of a few years
Exactly.
back, where like there were whole sections of the city of Detroit, this black city, that didn't have running water because the government was just turning people's water off. We
Yes.
also remember the Flint water crisis, where there was poisonous lead in the water. I mean, that was genocidal. What was done?
Yes.
That was like a crime against humanity.
If you even go further in Michigan, Michigan has further problems than just Flint and Detroit. Flint, although ironically, during the Trump administration, when everybody doesn't care about black people, is when stuff actually got located and fixed there. However, Michigan has tens of cities, most of them majority black, but not all of them majority black. Yes, I was just going to mention Benton Harbor. I see it in the chat. Benton Harbor is the one. I come from Watervliet, Michigan, which is 15 miles outside of Benton Harbor. And my entire life, I've watched the Whirlpool Corporation ravage Benton Harbor and then gentrify it in their own interests. They basically own this nonprofit called the Cornerstone Alliance, which is their city planning council. It's more or less entirely funded by them and a few other of the larger companies in the area. But they have a lead problem on par with the lead problem that Flint had. And there is not resources or attention even being directed towards Benton Harbor, Michigan. And they're one of, like I said, tens. If I remember right, it was something in the 60s. Like there was something like 60 towns in Michigan. There was a report sometime, I think it was 2017, 2018, that said this. It's a terrible situation. And privatizing that would add a layer of a total lack of accountability on top of it.
Yeah.
It would be insane.
Yeah, I mean, what Trump would never have dreamed of doing, Biden is now doing. And the other thing, and this was an important point, is that, and I quote Long Live Leninism, and I quote many places, if you're a communist in the first world, it is your duty to stand in solidarity with the people of the third world, right? Because we're up against the global imperialist system, right? And the RCP, they will refer to capitalism-imperialism because they have this understanding, right? Well, imperialism is a system of global monopoly capitalism where banks and corporations based in Western countries dominate the world and keep the world poor. And it is our job to stand in solidarity with the forces around the world that want to break out of that system. Well, the forces around the world that want to break out of that system, it's been made very, very clear to us what side they're on, right? If Bob Avakian had this pamphlet that he wrote on the coming Civil War. And it was funny because that became the basis of a right-wing conspiracy theory about Antifa super soldiers and all this silliness. But he argues, and, God forbid, I mean, the last thing that we'd ever want is there to be a civil war. But if indeed a civil war did break out in the United States between the Trump faction and the Biden faction, what side would China be on? What side would Russia be on? What side would Nicaragua be on, and Cuba and Vietnam and Iran and all the oppressed countries? What side would they be on? Turn on CNN any given day, and they will tell you immediately what side the imperialists want and what side they don't want. And that's really, really blatantly clear. So if your job as a communist in the center of the empire is to stand in solidarity with the third world, how can you be trying to help the imperialists clean up their own house and get Donald Trump out of there to make their system work better? Right? I mean, that immediately, if you have an anti-imperialist bone in your body, you should immediately go, wait a second, hold up. I mean, their main argument against Donald Trump is that Donald Trump, was supposedly in a conspiracy with Russia, right? That's what they used to say about communists, right? That's what they used to claim communists were supposedly. We're all agents of the Kremlin, right? Their
Remember
argument
all the
against
times they put like a hammer and sickle over Trump's stuff. It's just like, really?
Yeah. Yeah, and John Bolton said that if Donald Trump gets reelected, NATO as an alliance will end. Well, that would be great. That would be a tremendous thing, and in fact, that's one of their main arguments about why Donald Trump should never be allowed to be reelected. They said, is because they said that Donald Trump is a threat to the NATO alliance. Well, we should want to break apart the NATO alliance ourselves. We should celebrate that.
I like threats to the NATO alliance.
Yeah, and the fact that they don't seem to get this. They are so connected to political progressivism and what the woke people believe while being critical of the wokes that it's like it doesn't occur to them that like you're on the same side as most of the imperialists against a faction that is causing a lot of problems for the imperialists that the anti-imperialist world has made pretty clear they'd rather deal with. North Korea would rather negotiate with Donald Trump than with Joe Biden. And they've made that clear, right? It's not that they think Trump's a good guy, but they feel like they can get a better deal out of Trump than they can get out of Biden.
I think it's within this context, it's a pretty good question to ask. In the book, you characterize Bob Avakian as being used and also as an asset of French intelligence. I'm interested in how he's being used and how he is an asset of French intelligence. I mean, I've read the book. I know why, but like for everybody who hasn't.
Well, the section about him having been used, it was about what happened in 1979. And I get into that. 1979, right? That's, a time Mao has died. China is having its market reforms. Bob totally disapproves of China having its market reforms. He thinks they've sold out the revolution. His personal mentor, Label Bergman, disagrees with him and continues to defend China. So they have a falling out, and it's kind of a devastating thing. So Bob is the leader of the RCP. They've turned against China. And so Jimmy Carter is president of the United States, and he's invited Deng Xiaoping to the White House, and they're going to establish diplomatic relations. And what happens? Well, the Chinese embassy opens in Washington, D.C., and on the first day that it opens, the RCP trashes it. And they smash it, they destroy it, they break the windows, they like just lay siege to this new embassy, basically. They trash it. And then on the day when Deng Xiaoping is at the White House with Jimmy Carter, the Secret Service gives credentials to two RCP members who get into the White House Rose Garden and get up and make a scene and harass and make a scene and harass Deng Xiaoping on White House grounds and are escorted off White House grounds. Now, this happens, right? And they basically are making an anti-China gesture. They're attacking an embassy. They're making a scene. We now know that at the time that this happened, and I cite an academic book that recently came out, Heavy Radicals. At the time that this happened, the RCP was heavily infiltrated, not just by the FBI, but by a private intelligence firm called Western Goals. This is fascinating. Larry McDonald was a member of Congress. I believe he was from Oregon. And Larry McDonald was an anti-communist, and he was a member of the John Birch Society. And he started a private intelligence agency called Western Goals. And the John Birch Society and Western Goals were very opposed to the USA establishing diplomatic relations with China. They thought it was a betrayal of Taiwan. And so it appears, and that there was a woman who joined the RCP and kind of rose up its ranks. Her name was Sheila O'Connor, and she was a member of Western Goals and was passing on information to the FBI. And it very much appears that Western Goals was kind of managing the RCP and helping them to carry out these anti-China operations in 1979. That becomes very apparent because I have been a reporter in Washington, D.C. I was positioned in Washington, D.C. I went to State Department briefings and all that. Do you know how hard it is to get onto White House grounds as a reporter? I have never gotten onto White House grounds. They have never approved me onto White House grounds. Now, we're led to believe that the White House just granted press credentials to two communists who applied as communists to get their credentials to go onto White House grounds. Do you really buy that? That the U.S. Air Force and the Secret Service, they showed up, they listed the Revolutionary Communist Party as the organization they were there, and they said, oh, okay, sure, and gave them credentials to go into the White House. Now, do you believe that that was an accident? I don't. And I then quote the account that they published by the journalists who went onto the White House grounds and did this. And keep in mind, they published this right after they did this. They were arrested for disorderly conduct, and escorted off White House grounds. And then they immediately published this account. And in the account, it's nuts. They're describing like they're fantasizing about like burning the White House down. And you read it and it's like, this is not how any person who had any fear of legal repercussions for penetrating White House grounds would talk when they wrote something. I mean, you read the language of it. It's, you know, and then they describe how when they applied for their credentials in the line at the Air Force Base, they were telling the other reporters that they were communists and trying to win them to being It's like, give me a break, right? It's very, very clear that somebody in the American government wanted them at that press briefing, right? They did not get there by accident. They were allowed to get in there, and they were allowed to make the scene like they did. And then it gets even more interesting because this is 1979. What happened? Well, you know, there was a big demonstration that the RCP had outside the White House. A lot of people got arrested. And then they were facing criminal charges, and then those charges were dropped and then later reinstated. But what happened? The Los Angeles Times misquoted Bob Avakian as threatening the life of President Jimmy Carter. Right. So he sued the Los Angeles Times because that's a serious crime to threaten the life of the president of the United States. But it was in a major newspaper that he was, you know, threatening the life of the president of the United States. Right. At a time that, you know, a number of Pentagon generals had signed an ad in the New York Times basically calling for Jimmy Carter's ouster, saying he was unpatriotic, that there were ads all over the country by the John Birch Society and, you know, and other elements that were calling for Jimmy Carter to be removed and calling his establishing of diplomatic relations with China a big betrayal. And then the Iran hostage crisis happened, right? The U.S. embassy got taken. And so all these Ronald Reagan supporters, all the conservatives started having rallies against Iran, right? You know, condemning Iran. The RCP would show up at these rallies by right-wingers. Thousands of right-wing people would be there, you know, with, you know, F Iran and, you know, it's our embassy, release the hostages. And the RCP would show up, and in front of these right-wingers, they would burn American flags and get the living hell beaten out of them by crowds of people. And it was pretty clear they were like the rodeo clowns. They were like part of the show. Right? They were part of the window dressing. The far right wing, the Ronald Reagan wing of the deep state, was using the Revolutionary Communist Party as they were like characters in the movie. And in wrestling terms, they were the heel, right?
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, and that they were, and many people, you know, when I was in Cleveland, many people that were longtime peace activists in Cleveland were terrified of the RCP for that reason. That they had seen them so many times. They would go to situations where they would just get the hell beaten out of them, where they would just kind of act like the caricature of a communist. And it was almost like they were serving somebody else's agenda. And that's what I talk about. And I make clear in the book that the people that had infiltrated and were controlling the RCP and using them against China specifically and against Jimmy Carter also, that was the John Birch Society, and that was Western Goals. And I will add, Western Goals eventually dissolved because during the Iran-Contra scandal, it was made public because the Ronald Reagan wing of the deep state was using them to fundraise for the Contras in Nicaragua. And so they were revealed, and so they dissolved. I'm sure that they just changed their name. They probably still exist, right? But Western Goals, this group, and they went into all kinds of different communist groups and infiltrated them and tried to use them to carry out, you know, strategic goals for the Republicans and the conservatives. So that's 1979. But you wanted to talk about French intelligence also.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have that, and all of that is there. That is our intelligence. And it's also, I mean, they've infiltrated, but also there's a lot of genuine intent you can, like, it's dumb, but the vision that I have from them trying to seed communism among other reporters at the Washington press corps is like telling Rachel Maddow that she could become a communist if she wanted to. It's like, oh yeah. And that's a genuine kind of naive intent. However, beyond that infiltration, beyond that naive intent, there's a section about French intelligence that you talk about. You characterize Bob Avakian himself as an asset of French intelligence. What exactly do you mean by that?
Okay, so 1979, you know, the charges are reinstated against him, and they're continuing to fight the criminal charges. So Bob Avakian flees the United States to Paris, and he moves to Paris. And in Paris, he applies. He has a press conference, and he applies for political exile status. He makes a big show of trying to apply for political exile status, and he describes it in his autobiography. Well, the French government denied his political exile status. They said he could not be a political exile in France, but he stayed there. Bob Avakian lived in France from 1982 until 2003. So he had to have made some kind of arrangement in order to stay in the country. Now, we don't know. I don't have access to any public records about what kind of visa he had or whatnot. But what is interesting is in the book, he describes how he joined a kind of network of political exiles from around the world who had moved to Paris. And that's very interesting because Bob is not the only 60s radical to have fled the United States for Paris, right? Bob Avakian's friend, who he worked with at Ramparts magazine, Eldridge Cleaver, lived in Paris for a number of years before he came back to the United States and became a Republican. And Ira Einhorn fled to Paris around the same time. Bob fled to Paris in 1982. Ira Einhorn fled in 1981. Do you remember Ira Einhorn? Does that name ring any bells? Ira Einhorn.
Einhorn specifically.
Einhorn is the guy who claims to have invented Earth Day. He presided over the Philadelphia Earth Day celebrations. He was a well-known hippie environmental activist in Philadelphia. And he murdered his girlfriend. And the woman was missing. And so finally the police searched his apartment and they found her body mummified in his apartment. He was arrested for murder. So he was on trial. He was, facing trial for murder. So a number of very prominent people, including members of city council, put pressure on the judge to grant him bail, even though he was facing the death penalty. So he got bail. And the bail was paid for by the Brofman family, which is one of the wealthiest families in Canada. But I believe they're connected to the liquor and bottling industry. It's like a wealthy family. And then he fled the country. He disappeared, and they didn't find him until 1997. And where was he living? He was living in France under the name Eugene Mellon, and he was living in France. And apparently he had somehow, what's that?
Old melon head. Mellon.
Eugene Mellon was actually Ira Einhorn, and Ira Einhorn had been living in France. And then the French government went out of its way to try and prevent the USA from extraditing him. They went to ridiculous lengths. They didn't end up extraditing him until 2001, and they forced the state of Pennsylvania to pass a special law just for Ira Einhorn that, if someone is being extradited from France, we will not pursue the death penalty in the murder. They passed a special law. The French government bent over backwards to prevent Ira Einhorn from being extradited. And when Ira Einhorn came to the United States and finally did stand trial for killing his girlfriend, he claimed the CIA had killed his girlfriend, and he read hours of testimony about CIA mind control programs and operations that he was aware of when he was operating in the United States into the record. He was ultimately convicted of murder, and then he died in last year during the pandemic. He was in prison. But that's a very strange case, but it's very, very interesting, right? Now, also, since I've published this book, I've been contacted by a number of people who say, you don't know the half of it, Caleb. And I found this out, and this just put a smile on my face. When the war in Ukraine escalated, recently.
Yes.
Almost all the Trotskyites in Russia moved to Paris.
Wow.
All the prominent Trotskyite leaders in Russia that are anti-Putin, they claim they're communists, but they're anti-Putin, anti-Stalin. Almost as soon as that war got going, they were all on a plane to Paris. They relocated to Paris. And it's very clear that French intelligence has some kind of program for, exiles, political exiles, leftist radicals from other countries. They move to Paris and they join some kind of network. And it appears, and they probably don't realize it, that French intelligence utilizes these people as assets. And that's very clear. And in the book, I talk about one of the interesting things is that one of the main causes that the RCP organized around was the case of Mumia Abu Jamal. You know about Mumia Abu Jamal?
Oh, yeah. A big actually reason why I even knew anything about communism, in fact, was Rage Against the Machine advocating so heavily for Mumia al-Jamal. Yeah, sorry, I said it wrong, but...
Yeah. Well, I mean, Mumia Abu Jamal, I think he's innocent. He was a black revolutionary activist who was charged with killing a police officer.
I agree. I completely agree with that.
And in 1982, he was charged and convicted. They were going to execute him in 1995, but there was a huge global movement to free Mumia Abu Jamal, to stop the execution. The Pope supported Mumia. All kinds of people from all over the world, planes full of priests and nuns from Europe flew in, and the Amish supported Mumia, and the Mennonites supported Mumia, and anarchists and socialists and Rage Against the War Machine or Rage Against the Machine and the Beastie
Yeah.
Boys and all kinds of celebrities and Sean Penn
Yeah.
and Susan Sarandon, and they didn't execute him in 1995, right? It was a big
Yes.
victory. But one thing we now know is that one of the big entities that was supporting Mumia Abu-Jamal was the French government, right? There's a street in Paris named after Mumia Abu-Jamal. There are 25 different cities in France that have granted Mumia Abu-Jamal citizenship, including Paris. And in Paris, when they granted Mumia Abu-Jamal citizenship, they had a ceremony where the mayor of Paris invited Angela Davis to accept his certificate of citizenship. And they had this elaborate ceremony in Paris City Hall where the mayor of Paris pumped his fist and shouted, "Mumia is now a Parisian. Mumia is now a Parisian." And it was very, very clear that for whatever reason, French intelligence and the French deep state was opposed to the death penalty, and they don't practice the death penalty in the United States. And the French government has said as one of their principles, they oppose the death penalty and that they engage in anti-death penalty advocacy around the world, and that they supported Mumia Abu-Jamal. What's also interesting is that people don't realize this, but in France, the Communist Party is a major political party, right? It's one of the major parties. It has 14 seats in the parliament. It controls whole little towns and villages and such. And the French Communist Party is pro-imperialist. It supported the bombing of Libya. It supported the bombing of Mali. It voted to send weapons to Ukraine recently. I mean, the French Communist Party is not an anti-imperialist organization at this point. It's a wing of the French government, and that there is a whole wing of the French deep state that considers itself to be communist to some degree or other, in whatever sense that would mean. I
just put out marks for sale. Communist can mean a lot of things.
Right. And that also France is different than the United States. France's whole national identity is tied up with the revolution, is tied up with, the storming of the Bastille and the revolution. And that, in America, anti-communism, grows on trees, since the Cold War. We've been told that America is against communism, freedom, and all of that. In France, it's not like that at all. And in fact, in France, there are a lot of people who consider themselves to be communists or consider themselves to be revolutionary intellectuals to some degree or other. And that the French intelligence services have much more experience handling guys like Bob Avakian than American intelligence does, right?
Sure.
They know. I mean, if you look at every election in France, there are so many little tiny third parties that are led by guys who think that they're communists or socialists or whatever and have a little following. And, one of the main newspapers in France, you have L'Humanité, which is the Communist Party newspaper. But then you have Libération, and this is the main daily newspaper. It was started by Jean-Paul Sartre, and it was originally a communist Marxist-Leninist newspaper. And it's the New York Times in France. And that a non-revolutionary and non-anti-imperialist Marxism is more or less a big aspect of French national identity. There are millions of people in France who their understanding of the world is, they're not anti-imperialist and they're not revolutionary, but they think they're Marxists, kind of, right? That is a big part of French culture and French society. So to think that Bob may be an asset of French intelligence is really not, it's not a tough thing to understand. The other thing is the circumstances of Bob's return to the United States, right? And this gets even more interesting. When did Bob Avakian return to the United States? He returned to the United States in 2003. And in 2003, you'll recall, that was the height of rivalry between the United States and France over the war in Iraq.
Yeah, freedom fries. We were at that point.
Yeah. And you remember freedom fries. You remember all of that was going on. The next year, I believe it was at the Cannes Film Festival, Michael Moore was given the Palme d'Or for his Fahrenheit 9/11, and they gave him a standing ovation that went on for many, many hours. For many hours, they gave him a standing ovation. That is when Bob Avakian comes back to the United States. At that moment, that's when he decided, you know what, I've been in France for 2 decades, 3 decades, but you know what, I'm heading back to America. That's interesting, isn't it? When he comes back to the United States, suddenly the RCP launches a campaign to impeach George W. Bush, drive out the Bush regime. And they have a big ad in the New York Times, drive out the Bush regime. They're having national days of action, drive out the Bush regime. That's interesting, isn't it? That's a little bit interesting. At the moment that French imperialism and American imperialism are the most at odds, that's when he returns to the United States with this plan. He's going to drive out the Bush regime. It's also worth noting that the British playwright Harold Pinter that around that time, he won the Nobel Prize for literature, and he used his Nobel Prize reception to just give a lengthy speech against George W. Bush. The RCP made a big point of highlighting that speech and celebrating. And there was nothing communist about the speech. It was just Bush is bad, basically. Bush is bad. He doesn't care about climate change. He's threatening civil liberties, blah, blah, blah. But they went out of their way to promote Harold Pinter. And also the French government went out of its way to promote Harold Pinter. They honored, he was, the Legion d'Honneur or Honor de Legion or whatever the hell it's called, the biggest honor the French government can give you. When you're the Legion of Honor, they honored
the
Harold
golden baguette.
Yeah, right. They went out of their way
to give them the golden baguette.
Yeah, basically. And that's a little bit interesting, isn't it? And then we also know that when Obama came to office, right, Barack Obama, in a lot of ways, Barack Obama was campaigning in Europe rather than the United States. He went to Berlin and spoke to thousands of people, and Obama was going to restore the relationship with Europe that France had broken.
That was a big part of it.
That the United States had broken, right? That Bush had alienated Europe.
We tainted it with George W. Bush, who was an oaf and stupid and didn't know how to relate to people over there because they're cultured and smart and well-learned, and he was none of those things. So we need somebody who is.
Yeah, and that was very much a big part of what the liberals were about. And now, to top it all off, right? If you look at what the French Communist Party says about the war in Ukraine, they vote for sending weapons to Ukraine, but they're critical, though. They're saying roughly the same thing the RCP is saying, which is we don't want to escalate. World War III is dangerous, but they're continuing to vote to send weapons to Ukraine. And on top of that, the French Communist Party is blaming Russia, calling Russia the aggressor. If you read L'Humanité, the French Communist Party newspaper, it says basically what the RCP says about the Ukraine conflict. And we know that the French Communist Party is a wing of the French state and is heavily embedded with the French intelligence agencies. And the RCP, which was directed from France by Bob for many years and was involved in all of the French government's pet causes like Mumia Abu-Jamal, takes the same position. If you look at it this way, I'm not saying that Bob Avakian is a spy. He is not a spy, right? He's not engaged in
you make that clear when you define asset specifically in here.
Yeah, that an asset in intelligence terminology means that you're somebody whose behavior they can predict and that they can manipulate, right? Yes. He's not a spy. He's not an agent. He's not, he doesn't have a decoder ring, and he's not, no, he's not doing anything illegal, but he's
just a person of value or a thing of value even to them.
Yes, that they have cultivated him to do their bidding, and that wouldn't matter.
One of my favorite words, cultivated.
Yeah, they've cultivated him to do their bidding, and that wouldn't matter, except right now we're in the danger of World War III, and we're in the danger of a new world war, and that they have attached themselves to the more pro-war faction of the ruling class, and they are mobilizing, everyone that they can to support this pro-war faction. And on top of that, they have cut ties with and refused to defend any of the actual communist governments. And they've chucked the economics of Marxism and replaced it with this Jacobin ultra-democracy vision. So the fact that they are tied to the French state is very important because they take a plague on both your houses position. They say, well, we're against the Western imperialists and they call them the Russian and the Chinese imperialists. That's what they say, right? Well, that's easy to say, but at the end of the day, they're working for the French imperialists. They're carrying out the interests of the French imperialists and of the NATO alliance and the folks that are desperate to preserve the NATO alliance. And that's why it's important to point this out. And so that's why it's worth pointing out that this is the case. But there you go.
Yes, exactly. Kind of to round out the planned programming for the evening. Kind of with the material understanding of fascism we articulated earlier, and kind of how Bob Avakian fits in with the misguided characterization of his ruling class factions, the vulnerabilities that creates for being used. I think that your final chapter asks the correct question here, and I want to ask you this question, both sort of in relation to Bob Avakian and as a whole. Where does this revolution come from?
Yeah, well, that's a quote from somebody, because I remember I had been around the Revolutionary Communist Party when I was like 19, and then I switched to the Workers' World Party. And one of the women that mentored me was a woman who was in her 80s. She had gone to young pioneer summer camps in the Soviet Union. when she was a child, or not in the Soviet Union, in New York State with the Communist Party USA when she was a child. Her parents had been in the Communist Party USA. She'd been a founding member of the Workers' World Party. She was in her 80s. She was an older lady. And I showed her the DVD of Bob Avakian's speech, the revolution, why it's necessary, why it's possible. And she watched it. And in that speech, Bob starts talking about lynching and how bad lynching for black people in the South was. And then from there, he starts talking about how bad police brutality is. And then from there, he says, and we need to overthrow the American government. We need to have a revolution. And she watched it. And she said to me, he's only telling half the story. Because what about, the black rebellions against slavery? What about the Communist Party that organized against Jim Crow segregation and built, heroic, black and white sharecroppers unions? What about the Civil Rights Congress? And when he talks about police brutality, what about the heroic mass movement against police brutality that has taken place? And that he talks about America, and it's like there's oppression everywhere and it's bad. And so here I am. I've got the solution. Revolution. I've got the revolution that we all need, and he doesn't understand. That's not Marxism. Marxism sees history as driven forward by contradiction. There's two sides.
The class character of these things. You can't talk about police brutality without talking about the class character of it, etc.
Right. And that the revolution is going to come from the resistance of the people, from these mass movements that have always existed, from the labor movement, the women's movement, the black liberation struggle. And it'll be, the progressive movements of the people in the United States combined with the global struggle against imperialism. That is where any such revolution would come from. But in his revolution just seems to come from his own mind. He's got the answer. He's the leader of the revolution. You've got to get down with the revolution, follow Bob Avakian, know what BA is all about. That's not Marxism, right? It's like he's almost, it reminds you of like a medicine, like one of those old medicine salesmen, or what do they call them? Snake oil salesman. He comes to town. Well, are you struggling? Are you suffering? Well, what I've got here is the revolution. Have
He's got the little glass thing with the cork in it.
Right. Step right up. I'll sell you the revolution. That's not Marxism, right?
His special tonic.
Yeah, that's kind of what he presented.
Special tonic.
Right. And Marx specifically argued against that. And you do too in your book, Marx for Sale, right? And
I do, yes. That's a big component of the idea of Marx for Sale, is sort of moving away from the dialectical materialist specifically, conceptualization of how revolution happens versus an idealist one. You can't just project your brain onto the universe and expect it to happen, nor can you convince everybody that the revolution is the way. You can't, the best we can hope for as we're articulating criticism is that we erode resistance to the solving of these contradictions, as opposed to putting forward what's gonna happen is this. We can't do that. And what you're saying basically here is Bob Avakian is saying that's what we can do.
Yeah, it's, he's got his new synthesis, and, he's going to show up, and, that's the answer. And that is not a dialectical way of understanding these things. It's about existing social forces and contending. And that if you're a Marxist-Leninist, you have to understand that imperialism and defeating imperialism is what it's all about in this time, right? It is about defeating imperialism. And so based on that, you can't be on the same side that all the major imperialists are on in a divide in the American ruling class. That doesn't make the other side perfect, and that doesn't mean we should go all in for Trump, because there's plenty of bad things about Trump. But the idea that we should become partisans of the anti-Trump wing of the ruling class, the more powerful capitalists who don't like Trump, it's our job to be their foot soldiers and defend them from Trump. That has nothing to do with what the people of the world need now in their struggle against imperialism. And that is what I think my biggest disagreement with Bob Avakian would really be. And I would argue that position that he takes is based on the fact that he is an asset of French intelligence, and the French imperialists are desperate to keep NATO alive, despite whatever disagreements they have with the American imperialists. They may be critical of the death penalty. They may be critical of U.S. foreign policy here or there, but they are desperate to keep NATO alive. One thing that's worth pointing out, and this is a big difference between the Trump faction in the ruling class versus the mainstream of imperialism, is the International Criminal Court, the ICC, right?
Yes.
George Soros was one of the biggest supporters of creating the International Criminal Court, right? The International Criminal Court is a diabolical institution that has no right to exist. It is completely illegal. I used to work for Ramsey Clark, and Ramsey Clark would always point out that if there had been any talk of creating an International Criminal Court when the UN was founded, nobody would have formed the UN, right? It is completely illegal. There is no treaty. There's nothing that says we can create a court for the whole world. But George Soros, what's up?
Oh, I was just going to say, which is just a completely insane prospect, given the nature of the world, like the way that the world is currently divvied up. The idea you could have a central court that everyone is accountable to as entities that are not accountable to each other. It's insane.
Yeah. And, George Soros was able to push, and most of the NATO countries back the creation of the Hague and the World Court, but the United States doesn't. And George W. Bush, he said he would never sign on to the World Court. The U.S. government has passed a law that if the World Court were to ever try or arrest and try an American person, that they could invade the World Court. They've actually passed that law, right? Under Donald Trump, the USA put sanctions on the World Court, just like we put sanctions on other countries, right? They don't support the World Court. Now, it's pretty clear the American deep state doesn't support the World Court because they don't want any of these other countries to have any authority over them.
Well,
right?
Exactly.
They were particularly upset because of the fact that the World Court was investigating U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan, and for their own reasons that are not good, they opposed the World Court. But it's important to point out, every single person who's ever been convicted by the World Court has been African. Every single one. Did you know that? Every single one.
I did not know that, actually.
Single person convicted by the World Court who has not been African. Now, prior to the World Court, there was the International Criminal Tribunal on Yugoslavia, but that's different, right? The actual World Court has only ever convicted African people. And that the ICC has functioned mainly as a vehicle for French imperialism to dominate the African continent, right? If you look at it, right? It has functioned as a vehicle for some leader, leader of a terrorist group or a religious group, or some African leader gets on the wrong side of the French and the German and the Italian imperialists. Well, they can drag him to the World Court and find him guilty and lock him away, Now, the American imperialists oppose it for whatever reason, but the ICC is a bad thing. It's not a good thing. Yeah. And you'll notice the USA supports the ICC when it's convenient for them, right? The ICC,
I was going to actually point that out. There's times where it's just more than happy to let it do whatever the hell it wants.
Yeah. They, the ICC has issued a warrant for Vladimir Putin, and the White House is invoking this and saying, "Oh, well, Putin shouldn't be able to come to international gatherings and blah 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 because of the ICC." Well. The USA doesn't recognize the ICC.
Yeah,
the USA
is deferring to an authority that they allegedly are completely against. Right. Like you see it, you can even see, I mentioned Maddow earlier. I think she said something about it, if I remember right, on MSNBC.
The liberals support the World Court. Joe Biden, they won't say it because they don't want to offend the military establishment and the intelligence agencies that are so against it. But it's very clear that the more, quote unquote, globalist wing of the liberal establishment, they support the ICC and the International Criminal Court. So does
they like the idea of it because they think that they're kind of, it's not just that they see themselves as, the top of it. They see themselves as it, like the global imperial thing. The liberals associate themselves with it because they think that globalism is this mass liberalization, even though it's really not.
Yeah. I mean, and so these are the kind of things that are creating the contradictions among the imperialists in our time. And this is the kind of things that we need to understand the context here. Defeating imperialism is what it's all about. And the point of defeating imperialism is to unleash human growth. Communism, which Bob talks about endlessly, we're trying to reach the higher stage of communism. It's based on material abundance, right? If you read Critique of the Goethe Program, Marx makes that clear. You cannot have a communist society in poverty. The basis of the higher stage of communism is so much wealth existing that labor becomes life's prime want, no longer a necessity. People only work because they feel like working. And, when Sansara Taylor was giving her woke speech at I think it was at UCLA, somebody got up and they said to Sansara Taylor, well, what does the RCP have to say about artificial intelligence? And you know what her response was? She said, I don't know. She said, I don't know. Right. She said, we're going to have to, we're going to have to study it. Well, Marxists have been talking about labor replacing technology, the problem of overproduction, the reduction of human beings in the process of producing commodities. We're talking about that. That's like essential to Marxism. And when somebody got up,
I will say I prefer I don't know to a lot of the answers that I hear about AI, though.
That's true.
I would much rather hear somebody admit that they don't understand it than somebody put forward this idiotic, like anti-automation viewpoint, which a lot of Marxists and communists, and when I'm saying that loosely, obviously, but I see a lot of them do that. Like a lot of people fall. Everything all right?
Yeah, everything's fine. Everything's fine.
A lot of people fall for the scaremongering of artificial intelligence, though. I see a lot of people engaging in that while calling themselves Marxists, and I much prefer I don't know to that.
Yeah, but if she read Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific by
well,
Friedrich
yes,
Engels,
absolutely. 100%.
she would know, because it's in there about how the advances in technology, right? The advances in technology lead to greater poverty, and that is the entire basis of socialism. And socialism is about creating a society where technology and human advancement don't lead to greater poverty, where we don't have poverty amid plenty, right? And
you brought up Dutt a little bit too here, and Dutt is a very, very, very prescient author on this topic, because although there wasn't something called degrowth in Dutt's time, Dutt outlines very much how this automation problem requires the big capitalists to initiate ideology that would justify the degrowth agenda, the equivalent of it then talking about the artificial limitation, reduction, and destruction of the productive forces. Like ultimately, the crisis of imperialism, capitalism in its imperial stage, once it reaches that crisis point and needs to contract, that degrowth is part of the criticism that it was articulated in 1934. You can compare all of Jason Hickel's academic papers to what Dutt is criticizing in a 1934 criticism of imperialism and fascism. And so much of it just lines right up. And I think it's really, really important that people understand that although, degrowth didn't exist at that point, there's a critique of degrowth that exists, and it's called Fascism and Social Revolution by R. Palm Dutt.
Yeah. Yeah, and that this whole crisis that we're in is tied up with the computer revolution. It's tied up with artificial intelligence. It's tied up with all these problems that Marxists like R. Palm Dutt, like Friedrich Engels, like Karl Marx himself, this is so tied up with everything we understand. And if you take the economics out of Marxism and you just make it a struggle for liberation, you're going to miss everything, right? And that it's so important to understand the economics of Marxism in our time, because they're back with a vengeance, right? And that it makes sense for the baby boomer generation that you still had the post-World War II economic expansion going on, that they would miss this part of Marxism or think it was outdated or something. But the economic crisis that we're in right now is rooted in the built-in problems of capitalism. And the economy of China just continues to grow. They don't have this problem because they don't have capitalism. They have a centrally planned economy, despite a lot of market mechanisms. And that there is a rising alternative economy in the world with the BRICS that's emerging that doesn't have this problem. And this is why the imperialists are getting desperate, because their system is coming apart. And that understanding I don't see in Bob Avakian's work. And I would like people that look into Bob Avakian or look into joining some kind of really existing communist group, I would like them to understand this problem, understand the economics of Marxism. And so that's why I wrote the book. So I'm glad you had an opportunity to read it, Peter, and I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah.
I have one more thing I'd like to talk to you about. You mentioned the boomers.
Yes.
A generation that when I woke up this morning and I opened up Facebook and looked, they were all activated. It was about 6:30 in the morning, and I have never seen the boomers all active at once. But Jimmy Buffett died.
Oh.
And it's obviously sad when somebody who is well loved by a lot of people dies. I'm not bemoaning this or criticizing it. I'm bringing it up because there's actually a connection between Jimmy Buffett and Bob Avakian that I was going to bring up earlier, but honestly, you were in the middle of something, and really I wanted to let you keep going on it because it was good. But yeah, I just before we go, let's go into that just a little bit.
Sure. One of the most cringe passages in Avakian's autobiography is when he describes being at a Jimmy Buffett concert in the late 70s. And how he was at this Jimmy Buffett concert and everyone was high on marijuana. And in the RCP, they don't use drugs. So it was kind of awkward to be there because he couldn't use marijuana, and they were all high. And he saw how, the people in the audience were all high. I quote his exact words in the book. That made him think that it was in this auditorium at a Jimmy Buffett concert where all these people were stoned, that he had this idea that maybe the working class weren't the people to make the revolution. Maybe we shouldn't be trying to appeal to people on a class basis. We should instead be trying to appeal to edgy feelings among the youth and rebellious feelings among the youth. And that's where he had this big revelation. He describes that the working class, maybe the working class are not going to lead the revolution. We should just appeal to edgy feelings. And he talked about how, like, at this Jimmy Buffett concert, the kids were smoking marijuana, and it was like they were being rebellious against the man or against the government. And he thought maybe that was where the revolution would come from and not class struggle. And I find that passage, if you read it, it is just so sad. It is really, really sad. And it's a cry of defeat, right? It's a cry of,
it is absolutely 100%.
Yeah. It's a cry of, we've been in the factories for 10 years trying to win, workers to communism. They don't want to hear it. It's a cry of, we've been beaten up and arrested so many times. And, maybe we should just try to appeal to the kind of people that like to get high and go to concerts and want to be edgy. Maybe we should stop trying to build a real communist party. It's very sad. It's very sad.
I think there's also an element of contact high, perhaps, affecting his thinking. Yes. Like, he's like, I don't use drugs at all, but I'm having an epiphany at this Jimmy Buffett concert where everybody is smoking pot. I can't imagine why I'm having a similar feeling to them. I don't know what's going on here. How could it be that I'm having this epiphany about drugs? I'm not on them. I wouldn't ever be on them. But here at the Jimmy Buffett concert, I think that's the case. But it's ultimately it's a departure from class politics, and that's what's really important. You do give him a lot of credit on a lot of important things in this book, and I think that's something that's also really important to recognize before we go. But I think that for everybody who's watching and who's interested in something that you said, they should check it out. It's on Amazon. It's called Letter to Bob Avakian. It just came out last week, right? It was last Tuesday, I think.
Yep.
I lose track of time very quickly, so it's shocking I was able to remember that.
Yeah.
It's like I'm at a Jimmy Buffett concert. It's just wafting up in my face.
Well, I'm curious if we're going to get a response. I would love it if the RCP responded. I don't think they will, because they are very paranoid and they probably don't appreciate it. But I will say, I hope they actually read it, because it's not a hit piece. This is not a hit piece.
It's really not. It's genuinely, you're very deferent towards his leadership abilities in a way that's not, it's not patronizing. It's very genuine. And I think that's something that I wish more people were able to pick out, because we went over a lot of the criticism of the RCP here, but there is a lot to learn from them as well. Mm-hmm. It's just not necessarily that their core positions are ones that we agree with,
right? And that you learn a lot more in life when you look at the strengths of your political opponents than than their weaknesses. Their weaknesses are obvious because you have an issue with them, so you obviously know their weaknesses. But if you look at those you disagree with and say, well, what are they doing right? Look, they're still here. Bob is still on this train. He's still doing the communism thing. He's 82 years old. He's never surrendered. He's never given up. And there are so many people who tried to do what Bob did and build a communist group and completely failed and gave up 40 years ago. And Bob is still doing it. And that shows that to some degree or other, Bob really believes in what he's doing. And I talk about there is a charisma and a passion that he has. And that wouldn't be apparent if you just, look at them from the outside. That wouldn't be apparent. But if you look at the way that they've mobilized over the years and pulled off their national days of action, Bob has a certain charisma in his personality that he's able to get his group into like a frenzy. I remember during the days to drive out the Bush regime. I mean, it was like go, go, go. It was like we thought, that October 5th or November 2nd was going to be the beginning of the end of the Bush regime. We were, that it was like he can get the group kind of in a mania, kind of in a hysteria to carry out their goals. And that one of the points I make in the book is that there is a very spiritual quality to a lot of what he does. And that even though he's an atheist, he's a hard materialist, he has a spiritual charisma, and he's tapped into people's desire to change the world and to do what's right, etc. And that part of his confusion is that there's a denial of that. He wants to proclaim himself to be a pure materialist and all of that. And that has,
but he's an idealist. That's the other thing. It's just, there's the contradictions exist within him.
Yes, they do. And that, the attacks on the RCP that are standard, where they call it a cult and they say, oh, they worship Bob Avakian, those attacks are cheap and stupid. And what was done to them last summer was ridiculous. I mean, it was kind of baseless. And that very few organizations in the United States that are of the socialist and communist variety have accomplished anything near what the RCP has accomplished over the years. There are a few that I would say have come close, but the RCP is pretty much stands alone, and the level of dedication its members have, the willingness to make sacrifices. I mean, there is something there, that can be learned from. And I spend a lot of pages in the book talking about that rather than just my political critiques, which has been the focus of this conversation. So,
I mean, the critique is also as important. And to be frank, it's all like we need to be able to have both the positive and the critical view of almost anything that has some relevance in the history of the United States or even in the just recent history. Although I would say he goes back several decades further than either you or me. So ultimately there is value in anything that he has to say. Speaking of value, I think that there was a lot of value in everything said here. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate everybody who stayed with us and listened. Everybody have a good night. It was good talking to you, Caleb, and we'll see you all soon.
Yep. Talk to you soon.